behalf of our APT team and the Main Street Designers Task Force, welcome to the Main Street and Building Codes virtual workshop. My name is Mike Jackson. I'm one of the co-chairs of the APT Codes and Standard Technical Committee, part of the group putting this together. And I'd like to acknowledge the substantial help from the Main Street Designers Task Force. You can see their names there. Main Street designers from across the nation who helped us put this content together. Just as a recap of today's session or this week's session, the topics really revolve around the major consideration of fire safety, which is the part of the code we heard most about concerns. But there's more than one code and more than one document to cover. We'll also dip into the topics of accessibility, particularly an issue for first floor storefront issues, and energy conservation, which has been a topic of great concern going into the future. Our agenda includes looking at the details of these codes from different experts, and then we're going to finish with case studies, examples from around the country. A couple of notes about things that aren't included in our session that might be useful. We've heard a lot of concerns about seismic retrofits, and APT actually does a special training on seismic retrofits for unreinforced masonry buildings. And we're not going to do a deep dive into the environmental issues. Lead paint and asbestos come up because there's a lot of other public information on that topic. So we really are focusing on working on the small scale buildings on Main Street and these other code related issues. A shout out to our partners in this program. The Historic Preservation Education Foundation stepped up to the plate early as our supporter. We are very happy for the cooperation with Main Street America to expand our network and sharing our information across the country. And the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training has been a long-term supporter of APT on a variety of programs, and they are supporting us with the post-workshop publication of case studies. Main Street America will be familiar to many of you in this program because we know you are part of this broad network that we've cast. There's more than 1,200 cities or communities across the nation, sometimes multiple in terms of city-urban districts. But this represents a great constituency of people informed about their towns, wanting to support their development, and following a prescribed formula working with Main Street America on redevelopment. APT is an historic preservation-based organization, and we've had a special focus on historic buildings, those that have that designation, whether it's state, local, or national. There's an historic Main Street. But the two pictures here are two towns 15 miles apart. One is designated on the National Register and gets lots of recognition. The other maintains a very similar building stock, and it's older, but not designated. In doing our program, we really tried to balance presentations that emphasize special treatments for historic buildings, as well as the broader issue for the older, smaller scale, mixed-use buildings that really exist in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, across the country. The codes and standards that are most important to us in the development of our program have been those from the International Building Code Council and the International Existing Building Code, the International Energy Conservation Code are the two most important. And then we're also digging into issues of accessibility, and the ICC has cooperatively published the ANSI standards that are really the technical details on accessibility or universal design as we more broadly define it today. It should come as no surprise to you, but basically our whole areas of main streets and downtown commercial centers evolved because of building codes. In the middle of the 19th century, the concern over fires destroying city centers basically caused most communities to early on adopt a fire district in their downtown or central city, which required all buildings to be masonry building construction. So our whole basis of Main Street and the look of this character defining feature that's typical to us comes from the 19th century building codes and fire safety. Out of this came a modern technical definition of the type 3C construction, which basically are those brick and stone exterior bearing walls that have a high fire resistance rating, but an interior structure that could be wood framed or combustible. Most of the 19th century buildings are like this. As we move into the 20th century, Main Street evolves into more complicated and more diverse structural systems with steel, iron, and various concrete systems. So, but the bread and butter of many of our older main streets is this type of construction. So it's a focus of our effort on codes. And it largely worked with the appropriate fire protection systems. A fire in a single building hopefully did not spread to the whole community because of this idea of these non-combustible masonry bearing wall separating structures. Another early code requirement that has a strong impact on the character of our downtowns and our older building stock were early 19th century or late 19th century codes for housing that required natural light and ventilation. New York's Tenement Museum on the left is a wonderful restored example of that, maintaining that, including in New York, the dumbbell plan, which had light wells into the interior, which we've largely sort of discontinued use of today. But basically, early concerns about light and natural light drove the idea of how big a building could be. And one of the problems we sometimes have is long, skinny Main Street buildings and light and air, but that's something we can generally deal with today with modern systems. So what would I say is a typical Main Street building that kind of defines the universe that we're looking at? It's a 2 or 3 story masonry bearing wall structure on a 0 lot line face to face with masonry party walls. And this has shaped downtowns across the US, beginning in the 18th century particularly, and throughout most of the 20th century. And on that platting of Main Street, it was often done on a lot size of 20 to 25 feet, which becomes, again, one of the modules for the Main Street look of the buildings that we're all concerned about in our program. In the 19th century, these structures often had a hybrid structure of cast iron, as you see on the right, sort of an early metal system holding up the front with the wide storefront and the big windows and masonry above. That was the common format for much of the building stock of America. The building on the left is a 3-story example. It's kind of an unusual one. It was an 1850s masonry building that in the 1890s got a new sheet metal front added to it from the Mesker brothers. A kind of an interesting variation on Main Street design, but with that wonderful character of the street and the richness of detail that we see as part of the Main Street character. In the 20th century, we have changes in structure, but a lot more changes in material. The first floor structure is basically often just masonry with steel lintels across that. Architectural terracotta comes into play. And then as we move into the mid 20th century and the Art Deco era, we see more playful use of details, but again, more use of non-combustible materials, steel windows, steel structural systems. So Main Streets vary considerably into the 20th century from their 19th century formats, but you still see this street wall of punctured openings, street-oriented architecture. In the Main Street program nationally, we take a preservation approach to economic development. It's incremental, tries to work with small property owners to say, what can they do with their properties? We know there are major economic challenges to be addressed. The move to online retail has resulted in many vacant storefronts and challenges to keeping the downstairs or the first floor of our buildings going and active and useful. And there's also been traditionally a high vacancy rate on the upper floors. Oftentimes they were originally residential and they became converted to other uses, and now we're seeing a movement to putting them back into use as residential. Main Street America has said, make housing a priority. We know that the nation has a shortage of literally millions of housing units. We only build 1 million units a year and our country could use more. These vacant floors often had housing units originally and they're easily adaptable. And they're areas and buildings that have complete infrastructure. So we don't need to sprawl out, we can sprawl up, we can use that. But we know that in our code world, when you do a change of occupancy, in converting a building from a prior use to a new use, such as from an office to a residential, there are often more extensive code-related provisions that trigger. We're going to look at this in more detail because it's one of the issues that we've seen that comes up as somewhat of a cost barrier in the housing conversion. Now, America's first building code that was national was in 1905, but it took us 100 years, literally, till 2003 before we had the first national existing building code. And this is really the core document that we're going to work with. The IEBC gets changed on a 3-year basis. So we're up to the 2021 edition now, but we know that many of your communities are probably using a slightly older version as the community updates which version of the code they use. The ICC Building Department Administration Manual has this really important quote: "The repair, alteration, addition to, and change of occupancy in existing buildings are in many cases more complicated to design and regulate than the construction of new buildings." There's a widespread recognition within the ICC and the codes that there's a lot of nuances to working with existing buildings and complexity to that. Our code session is going to answer this question, or we pose this question: why is it more complicated? And what, therefore, can we teach you through this workshop? Well, we know there are multiple code paths within the code, and you're going to hear from experts on the work area method, the historic preservation chapter, the performance standards path, or the performance path. So we know that there are different paths to use, and our session is designed to address those. We also know that historic buildings are treated differently. And there's a separate chapter for historic building that has some minor details and a lot of different things with us. We also know that most architects and code officials are most familiar with the prescriptive path used for new buildings and the IBC. And there's actually fairly small amount of training on the existing building code. So we're hoping to fill that gap with this national conference. And it's not a standalone thing in the code. It's not just one book. If you have the International Existing Building Code, you know that it refers to reference standards and you go back to the IBC. So understanding how codes work has a lot of levels to it. And the code language frequently says that it's subject to interpretation by the local code official. In my acronym, the authority having jurisdiction. And we're also concerned that the historic preservation chapter has not been updated. The APT has a mission to work with ICC on updating that, so that's been on our work list. And that codes can be subject to local amendments, and that's both an excellent chance for us to tweak things and maybe make things better. So we're going to touch on that topic at the end. So we hope that this framework of things that we can address to talk about the problems and complexity is why this workshop has been so sought out for so many of you. One of the first questions that comes up in this is, again, interpreting the code and who sets the roles for this. The ICC allows the architect to select the code path, and that design professional varies widely in terms of how the state laws are written, of exactly what level of professional is needed, whether it's an architect or an engineer. If it's an architect, we know that rural communities are often underserved by the profession and that there's more architects that work with new construction than residential or older buildings. So that's an issue in terms of access to the professional skills needed to make these decisions. When you need an architect, and I'm using here the architect as the licensed professional, will vary based upon the proposed work. And the ICC, the codes are very good at defining a level of change and increasingly levels of complexity based upon the work. What I will say is that when you get into a change of occupancy and you move from one use to a different use that is a trigger to code provisions on change of occupancy, you probably need a design professional involved to make that decision and help you with that. Obviously, working with your local official at the very beginning helps you do this. And an early meeting with a code official is important to all of these to understand the rules, who can play them, and what you need to work with. Can't stress enough a good cooperative relationship with local code officials. One of the reasons there's a big concern for us on how the change of occupancy exists in the code and its interpretation is that the 1927 Uniform Building Code was one of the first in the country that actually defined by cost value that if you spent more than 50% of the value of an existing building, that it had to meet the requirements of a new building. This idea of a cost-based formula for older, low-value buildings has become a barrier, because if you are in a smaller community where the downtown buildings are worth a fairly small amount, percentage-wise, and you go to rehab it today, you would easily exceed that 50% and trigger this new construction. This bias towards this idea still exists in the code, but we've largely removed the specific cost triggers from the new codes. The IEBC, with the work area method, really responded and said we should have a more proportional method of assigning owner-decided decision trade things they want to do versus what the code requires based upon the level of work you're doing. So at the repair level, you pretty much are just working with what you're not. There's not a lot of other things that are triggered, but the work area method, in my opinion, when you get to change of occupancy, is really working kind of like the older, earlier codes, where there's an assumption that everything's going to be brought up to some new level, which has been historically a problem to do with historic and older buildings. Now, there can be extensive renovation of an existing building, but if there's no change to use, in this case, here's a small little Main Street building, one means of egress and a fixed outside metal staircase. Previously, there were two little studio apartments. This was a gut rehab to put one proposed single bedroom unit up there. So no change of use, residential to residential, from a 2-unit to a 1-unit, reducing, in fact, the use demand. And this kind of work could be done without necessarily triggering a licensed design professional, because it's no change of use, no change of egress. It may be a high level of alteration, but the change of use is, and change of occupancy is the higher trigger than just the amount of work. But again, this varies with local interpretations, but I'm trying to present this as an example. There could be extensive work on an inside of a unit, but no change to the egress path means a fair amount of work can be accepted without necessarily getting a special code interpretation on the change of occupancy. Now, one of the things that we've discovered in reading the details about historic buildings in the various code compliance methods is this kind of provision. The code says, and this is from the prescriptive method, provisions of the code requiring improvements relative to a building's existing condition, relative to its pre-damage condition, that's referring to fire damaged buildings, etc., shall not be mandatory for historic buildings unless specifically required by this section. So there's interesting language here that says, you know, there's some things that are not mandatory for historic buildings. But then the next section, it talks about life safety hazards. And then it says the provisions of this code shall apply to historic buildings judged by the code official to constitute a distinct life safety hazard. We're going to dig into this term. In chapter 12, which covers historic buildings, it has a similar clause where basically it refers to distinct fire hazards as defined herein, and says that then if you have a distinct fire hazard, you should install an approved fire extinguishing system. And then it allows an exception where the code official can approve alternatives. This, again, distinctive fire hazard versus distinct safety hazard is only in the language affecting historic buildings. So because it's kind of a high trigger and established this idea that you need a sprinkler system and a fire extinguishing system, let's look at this term. The code actually doesn't define a distinct fire hazard or distinct safety hazard. We proposed a definition that we actually took from the California Historic Building Code that says any clear and evident condition that exists as an immediate danger to the safety of occupants of the building or the adjacent public right-of-way. And the conditions here really are about operational concerns in the fire code are not necessarily a distinct hazard. The fire code might talk about a blocked exit. While removing the blockage from the exit is an operational thing. The fire code might talk about storing combustible paint materials in a stairwell. That would be an operational issue. So operational issues are covered by the fire code. The building code really looks at what is something that's permanent with the structure that needs to be repaired or is missing. I would generally argue that most of the things that I see as distinct hazards are often missing things. So let's look at this one, life safety. In the code for historic buildings, stairway railings, it says grand staircases shall be acceptable without complying with handrail and guard requirements. Existing handrails and guards on all stairways are permitted to remain, provided they are not structurally dangerous. But here's two examples where I would say there is a distinct hazard. If your staircase does not have a handrail that's easily graspable. And this example on the left, it's got an intermediate handrail, but it doesn't have a consistent good handrail. The addition of a new handrail here covers that life safety hazard. Similarly, building codes now have a higher requirement for guards, and that's the horizontal railing that you see here at the staircase. And if it's under 36 inches in height, which was for a long time the established height for a guardrail, we changed that to 42 inches in the newer codes. So if it's under 36, I would say that's a distinct hazard. And you need to do something as an addition to solve the problem of a safety hazard at a guardrail. So here's an example of a safety thing that's really related to non-dimensional or non-conforming elements that aren't appropriate. Even though the code says you can retain these, I would say these are probably a distinct hazard. However, I would say that an older handrail that's wider is probably not a distinct hazard. The modern railing requirements are a very small dimension for easily graspable handrails. And we know that historically, most old staircases had a wider handrail, but they're still made with curves and shapes that make them graspable. So typically, I think an old handrail is graspable and it may not have continuity, but I don't think that rises to the level of a distinct hazard. Only if you had a very large, like 12-inch wide sort of modern or larger stone profile at the top of your railing might it be non-graspable and you would need something. So a couple of ideas on distinct hazard regarding stairs and handrails. The building code allows repairs to be made with like materials if you have an historic building. So if it's historic, like materials are permitted with the exception of hazardous materials such as asbestos and lead paint and glazing. For store owners, I think this is a particular issue. If you have a glass door or you have a display window with a bulkhead that's lower than 18 inches, the code says this is deficient today. I would say this is a safety hazard that's distinct, but the good side of this safety hazard is this is easily repaired with a modern safety film. So basically you can convert a piece of plate glass to a safer piece of glass for breakage purposes with the addition of the film. And it's a clear film that goes on one side of the glass, doesn't affect your maintenance. And so we can remove a distinct hazard through a modern additive technology. And you don't have to do a sprinkler system to address this distinct hazard. So here's a distinct hazard on Main Street. On the upper floors of our downtown buildings, we often had corridors with glass transoms. And this was an idea of letting natural light in. Largely not needed anymore because of the artificial lighting that we can do today, which is so much more efficient. If you add a sprinkler system to a downtown building, it says you can leave your transom by putting a sprinkler head on both sides. And in the historic preservation chapter, if you add a transom to a transom, a fixed wire glass piece of glazing set in a steel frame on one side of the transom, you can leave it in place. And this really eliminates the potential higher fire hazard of compartmentalization from one side, an apartment side, to a corridor side. And this has been a long-standing provision within the code. And I would say this meets a distinct hazard with a relatively easy retrofit, just like the retrofit of a film, and a retrofit with a wire glass can basically handle a distinct hazard. Now, here's a distinct hazard that I think could not be met with a simple fix. On the right, you see a window in an upper floor apartment and a corridor that goes to a 3-story light shaft. This multiple floor light shaft through the inside of a building in non-combustible construction system, or combustible construction system. This is the kind of distinct hazard that requires major intervention or a sprinkler system, because you've got a vertical shaft that could really allow fire to go through the building. So these are not common anymore. They occasionally show up. But these interior light courts would be, to me, an example of something that was a traditional material or design feature in an older building that could be considered to be a distinct life safety or fire hazard. More often, the challenge that comes up that we see on codes that I want to kind of dig into, and you're going to hear more about in our workshop, is the change of occupancy, particularly putting more housing. If you put housing upstairs in a vacant space, prior use comes into consideration, but this creates issues of egress, fire separation, what level of fire protection besides fire separation, the sprinkler or not, and then cost design and issues related to that. First issue for you is the number of exits you need. And the building code, and basically this comes where you start with the IEBC, you end in tables in the building code. Only small scale 2-story buildings are allowed to have a single egress from the second floor for residential occupancy. And in this case, a maximum of 4 units. And this says a travel distance of 50 feet. So this puts us in that little small scale building that I showed an example of earlier. So only the smallest buildings. And once you get to 3 stories, you're into requirements for 2 exits. And that can be, front and back, side by side, depends upon how large your building is. So this has been a long-standing interpretation of the code. And further, so here's that example of that small-scale building I said on Main Street. The IEBC specifically says, and it has this exception, for buildings less than 3,000 square feet total, existing conditions are permitted to remain at all stairways and guards. So this basically grandfathers in the existing stairs, railings, and guards on all small-scale buildings on Main Street. But I still would point out there could be some need for better gripping on handrails and guardrails, depending upon these dimensional exceptions I've talked about. The code is very clear about the issue of fire protection and separation. This is that topic of related to enclosures and safety from having barriers and fire rated systems. Fire protection is required by Chapter 10 of the IEBC. And if you look at all the references to this, it ultimately gets you to a chapter in the International Building Code, which says you need a 2-hour separation between an R use on the second floor and a business or mercantile use on the first floor. So this 2-hour fire separation between the first and second floor becomes a really real design issue in terms of rehab. Chapter 12 in historic buildings has its own little section on change of occupancy, but it pretty much gets you back to the other code provisions. It doesn't give you much issues of details, and we're going to have more details in this conference on the change of occupancy in the IEBC Chapter 12, but it doesn't basically allow you to use Chapter 12 to eliminate the 2-hour rating requirement. Why is this such an issue? We know that there are lots of downtown and older Main Street buildings that had a tin ceiling on the first floor. And a tin ceiling is a wonderful historic character defining feature that actually has a fairly minimal fire protection rating. So this, if you converted a building and you were needing to get a 2-hour rating, what are you going to do? Here's a very typical existing condition. And how do we get to 2 hours? Well, if you put a sprinkler system in, you generally have met that requirement. By putting the sprinkler system in, you're not going to have to change that separation rating. And I want to make a very important point here in terms of meeting the design standards for preservation. It's largely been accepted that exposed sprinkler piping on the first floors of our commercial buildings, even when they have an exposed tin ceiling like this, generally is not considered to be a threaten, destroy, or alter the historic character. The minimal dimensions of sprinkler piping, and it could be on the ceiling like this held away, or it could be on the side walls, depending upon your dimensions. But I'm making a point that here that the sprinklers in and of themselves are probably not going to do damage to the historic character. So it's better to basically work with them exposed rather than trying to rip everything out and bury them. And this, again, if you're furring out walls, you might be able to bury them, but in this case, we generally accept this as an appropriate historic preservation treatment to have them exposed. But that can be expensive compared to other options. And I've got 3 different scenarios here of what you could do. And removing and reinstalling a tin ceiling with a new drywall is technically doable, and it is virtually impossible to do it really well. The old tin ceilings do not remove nicely and stay straight and crisp. They bend, they buckle. So this is an extremely high level of difficulty. It would conceivably be possible to remove a ceiling and put a new ceiling that would be similar in design, that would be less expensive than removing the existing one, but then you've lost the original material as well. You can also, though, increase the fire rating of the assembly by adding insulation into the floor cavity, or even improving the rating of the second floor. But again, depending upon how much you're putting on the second floor, that could change your doors and door thresholds and other issues on the second floor. So it has issues. And lastly, you're going to hear in our program a session on the use of intumescent coatings, which is a new kind of technology that goes on like paint and can definitely increase the fire performance rating, because this intumescent paint swells up in a fire and improves the fire rating of tin ceilings and other materials. So these are 3 examples of preservation-based approaches that can basically address the 2-hour rating. And then there's always the issue of what if you go through this and you get an hour and 45-minute rating instead of a 2-hour rating. There's where the authority having jurisdiction can say, listen, if you got that close, we'll accept that given other conditions. And we're also going to dig into the code options on that as well. Now, lastly, I want to move from the discussion about what's in the existing code that are some of the major issues for us to what you can do about it. And what we discovered is that states and cities across the US are amending the code. Only a few states maintain a specific state historic building code. California has the state historical building code, and Ohio uses its own code as well that basically works with the older performance measures from the Boca building code from the 1980s. So Ohio is also kind of working on its own on this and has been very successful with their historic buildings on that. Now, one of the benefits of joining APT, just being aware of this, is that our APT Codes and Standards technical website researches these local amendments, the local and legacy codes that exist, and we place links to these online. So we're part of your research universe of finding out what are other codes saying about these details. Now, amending the code. The California Historical Building Code says this under change of occupancy: the use or character of the occupancy of a qualified historic building or property may be changed from or returned to its historical use. Such a change in occupancy shall not mandate conformance with the new construction requirements. So what does this mean? This is a really interesting thought. It basically says if you have an older downtown building, and originally it had a residence on the second floor, and then in the 20th century, that residence was converted to an office, and you're now going to convert it back to a residence, that is not considered a change of occupancy. Because if you can identify an historic use to the property on the upper floors, that constitutes an existing condition to them. So they allow you to go back to an earlier condition. So this is an interesting way to interpret the change of occupancy clause by allowing other occupancies that may not be obvious. The general term of art today in the code world is the last known legal occupancy. One of the problems we've seen with people is that the upper floor is vacant. Vacant is not an occupancy. Vacant is a current use, but it's not an occupancy to change from. It's what was the last known legal use. And when you've got a building that's been vacant for decades even, this involves a little bit of careful research to identify what was there. But if you can identify a building was originally used as a residential, California says, then you can convert to residential today, and it doesn't trigger the change of occupancy requirement. Now, in our research on amending the code, one of the most extensive local amendments we discovered was this one from Telluride, Colorado. It's an historic mining and resort town today in the Rocky Mountains. And they have a Appendix 15A that says the historic building enhancements to the IEBC. this basically reads as an example of an historic chapter 12 in the IBC. It's like another version of chapter 12, but more extensive in the topics it covers. And they've dug into even the dimensional tolerances, which I'm going to talk about some more. The building codes today do not give you any dimensional tolerances. Well, they proposed a 5% tolerance for historic building features. One of the first places where we saw this in writing in an amendment to a local code. So worth reviewing because of the extensive level of things in this, and it's readily available on their website. Now, Aurora, Illinois, a larger town in Illinois outside of Chicago, has a lot of early 20th century and larger commercial buildings in their downtown. And these are buildings that were originally built with elevators. They amended their local code to allow the retention of an original elevator shaft and size. And what they were basically saying here is the same thing we've said about staircases for years. Changing a staircase is largely technically infeasible. To change the riser tread ratio of staircases gets into structural elements. Changing the size of an elevator similarly is technically infeasible because you've got to do all kinds of structural things to get to this. Now, a modern elevator is designed for an ambulance to be able to get a stretcher and pull it into the elevator. So that's our modern safety level, a deeper shape to an elevator for long-term protection and use. But that can be really expensive to maintain. So they amended their code and basically grandfathered in the elevator size. So there may be issues of that related to ADA as well, but they're basically citing the issue that the structural infeasibility is largely there to changing an elevator shaft. Now, Denver has just recently taken an extensive look at the Appendix AJ of the International Residential Code, and they made several important amendments to that. One of the first things they did was to define the qualifications for an historic preservation professional. So if the code says you have to identify character defining features and you don't want to adversely affect them, damage, threaten, or destroy, they basically referred to the National Park Service standards for the preservation profession to say a licensed design professional or someone that meets the qualifications that are established by the federal government for an historic preservation professional can make that decision. So we've heard concerns from code officials about they can't understand how to decide what is an authentic or historic character defining feature. So this builds into the code a reference standard for who can do that. The other thing that the folks in Denver did was they created an extensive list of dimensional tolerances that they would accept in residential construction. And these vary from 0 to 17%, with the most common accepted dimensional tolerances is that of 10%. So they basically said across the board, a blanket of 10% discretion was there to existing elements. Some of the exceptions were minimum ceiling height. So if you have a very low ceiling height, if there's a minimum, they're not going to let you get 10% lower than that. That would be one where they said no, 0%. They're up to, I think 17% was on a door width opening or something like that, and they related that to accessibility requirements. So this was a very well thought out, detailed amendment to look at all the different dimensional places in the code where there are potentials of discretion, and giving the code officials some guidance on, if it's close enough, can I allow it to be maintained? There's the blanket allowance generally for retaining existing things, but this gives you some ideas on dimensional tolerances, which were missing from the code. So hats off to Denver on this one. Now, most of the things we were looking at as changes to codes were really about life safety and trying to be kind of cautious and look at alternatives. This is a change of the code in terms of who can meet which code. That's fundamental and big, and it's driven not from the issues of life safety as much as it is driven by the point of affordability. So last fall, just November, Memphis and Shelby County rolled back a provision of the building code that said instead of 1 and 2 family only building units, housing units using the residential building code, they're allowing 3 to 6 flats to be reviewed under the residential building code. This reduces the design requirements for the documents that go to the code department, basically puts the builders more in charge of this, and they're really doing this because they want to encourage more residential construction and affordable construction. And they saw the cost differential to go from the residential code to the building code, to the residential code, to being a cost issue of causing affordability issues, and they wanted to address that. So this is a kind of a significant new challenge to what we've thought about long-standing rules of how the code works. 2-family and under was building residential code. Larger than that went to the commercial code. So this has some implications for us on Main Street. If you moved to the residential code and you did a conversion and you went to an all residential building, then you could use the residential code. And I'm not generally in our Main Street work, we're generally not promoting converting storefronts on the ground floor to residential use in the centers of our business districts. But there are lots of edges. This is a neighborhood commercial building in Springfield, Illinois. It's not part of the downtown. It's all around a residential district. This was converted to a residential use on the first floor. So using the model of the Memphis, a 4-unit residential building could be done under the residential building code, which simplifies the design and construction for these sort of conversions. So there's some possibilities of this in our Main Street districts. But I'd like to propose another challenge. What if 2 or fewer units on the second floor could be done for buildings under 3,000 square feet using the International Residential Code? This would be a simpler version of this, and it would, in rural areas where we've got access issues to architects and design professionals, this may be an easier way to allow the conversion. Now, this example I'm showing here was done in 1960, and it was done by an architect. It's an early loft conversion, but this idea that maybe there is a place for amending the code to allow the IRC to be used on the second floor of 2-story small-scale buildings may be a way from an affordability and reducing the barrier of access to professionals to encourage the rehabilitation of upper floors. This is an idea I think that's going to be worth exploring as we look at amending the code in the future. Now, another long-held issue within the building code world has been that of single exit buildings. There's been some work on this in Pittsburgh and New York City, which has a lot of smaller scale 5-story buildings. But Charlottesville, Virginia recently changed their building code to allow up new 5-story buildings with full sprinkler systems to be built with a single exit system. And now this is related to a lot of construction details for the fire protection of the single exit and the format. And research on this has come out of the West Coast, out of Seattle, and out of Europe, because basically many European building centers basically are building centers like in Paris that have single exit buildings. And they use other fire protection systems that have worked quite well. So this challenge to the idea of a single exit staircase when you sprinkler would help offset. So if we have a higher threshold of cost to add a sprinkler, maybe one of the benefits of that is reduced exit requirements. Now, the current code says this: single exit buildings with sprinklers. An automatic fire extinguishing system or sprinkler shall not be used to substitute for or act as an alternative to the required number of exits. So basically, when you sprinkler a building, we now give you longer travel distances, but we don't allow you to reduce your number of exits. So if we had an alternative that allowed basically a fully sprinklered building to have fewer exits, it may make it more affordable to basically substitute building that staircase to building a fire sprinkler system. So this is another one of these ways we could amend the code to think about affordability with a parallel level of safety. So these are really some interesting challenges as we move forward to think about how can we use the code more efficiently. Moving to the kind of topic to incentives, Hutchinson, Kansas recently replaced their sidewalks. And when they did so, they put a sprinkler capacity water line into every building on Main Street. So basically, if the city had to dig up the street and put everything in there, they use that as an opportunity to upgrade the water lines. A very thoughtful way to basically use public funding expenditures to assist fire safety. Great Bend, Kansas, just a short distance away, now has a fire safety grant program for their downtown. And basically, it's under a downtown loft housing grant. They have a formula of up to $5.50 per square foot for the installation of sprinklers or other life safety fire alarm systems. And you have a minimum expenditures. Your building owner is going to be spending at least $50,000 to basically, and what they're looking at is people putting upper floors in their downtown back into use and using in effect, the cost of the sprinkler to be the incentive to encourage people to invest in life safety improvements. So these are ways cities can work creatively to help, again, put more housing downtown and overcome kind of the sprinkler cost barrier that's often one of the issues we hear about. Now, if you're not an APT member, we want you to join because our APT Codes website is a resource link for you. We are gathering the data on historic building codes, regional and state building codes and amendments, legacy codes, and then our new changes that we propose to the IEBC. So the APT Codes and Standards Technical Committee is taking a lot of initiative on this topic. Our APT Building Technology Heritage Library is a place to find archival building codes, and we will be expanding this next year, working all the way up to 1963 to get all the building codes and the prior issues of the building codes in America on a free open access to everyone. So we see part of our mission to giving you the tools of knowing what the historic building code said, so you can understand what you're starting with. Another part of our program is that APT will be posting the case studies from this and other examples on our website. We have separate funding from the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training to publish our case studies. I want to thank you on behalf of APT and our Main Street Design Committee for participating in this workshop. We hope you learn a lot about the buildings of Main Street and the ways in which building codes can make our buildings safer and keep them active and used into the next generations. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Marilyn Kaplan. To all of the 400 of you out there, apologies and thank you for your patience. The potential failure of technology is always kind of scary. As Kristen has indicated, we'll make sure all the content's available, and certainly a shout out to Kristen and the folks at White Cloud Media who shepherded us through today's challenges. So a couple of items from the chat. We do get a question on the intumescent coatings. We'll pick that up later on. We heard that a few states and our communities have their own existing building codes.
Recording in progress.
Track all of those. So please send us a note via the chat if your community also has significantly modified the existing building code. Mike, the question that came for you really is focused in the state of Washington, but will apply to others as well. So in Seattle, where no lesser life safety code change is permitted unless it's approved by the State Building Code Council, in Seattle, if the change of occupancy will trigger substantial alteration and including provisions and requirements for seismic and energy conservation. Do you have any further information or thoughts on that?
Well, just that we've heard that from several other states. Wisconsin has a similar provision in their state statute that prohibits a local government from amending a code to a less stringent standard. So that language apparently is not uncommon in the interpretation that we don't want local jurisdictions, running to less strict standards. But this gets to be a kind of a tricky problem in terms of what is the threshold here on a residential measurement. 1 unit or 2 unit is residential code, 3 units is not, but so is 40 units. But so from 2 to 3 is a big jump in the code. How big and a strict thing would it be to switch from 3 to 4? And that's kind of what Memphis did. So The judgment call there is really what we're talking about. When can you be flexible about where are those strict code lines that are written? I saw another thing in the chat about tolerances. And what we were talking about is dimensional tolerances, where in the code, it has a specific mention of dimensions, the length of a dead end corridor to the hour rating of a wall assembly. Those are both places where there's potentially a tolerance. Denver wrote in a 10% across the board tolerance for historic building features. So it'd be a documented historic feature. And it said, if that's authentic and it is within 10% of what the current code, that's grandfathered in. So we've had the code grandfathered in stairs and handrails without any dimensional tolerances. This is a way to kind of make it a little more strict. And we think that's a good way to help be flexible, but give some guidance to the code officials. And I want to reach out here to the code officials. They're the ones constantly put on the front line to make those judgment calls, and they're not giving any guidance in the code of where and how much flexibility should they have. So by putting in a 10% factor, it gives the code official something. The good news about the Denver study, and they identified, I think, something like 120 different dimensional reference points in the residential code. And they said there are things that can't be changed. Minimum ceiling height, we can't go lower than that. The frost depth that's required, that's physics. So we can't change the frost depth and allow for that. So they looked at the things and said, which things aren't potentially flexible, but then they look at the other things that this is where we can accept this tolerance factor. And if it's an historic building, could you even go beyond that? That's where, again, the judgment call comes in. So what we're looking for is how to make the code clearer and easier for the code official to work at, because old buildings don't have everything in them, just the same as a new building feature. And that was the premise of our whole study, was how to give flexibility in the code with reasonable tolerances.
Mike, we have a couple of questions about what about if you're in a municipality that does not adopt the IEBC? Any recommendations for where to start?
I mean, if you're not using any building code, I'm assuming if you're a community with no building code, you've got to have some reference standard for any kind of building construction. So whether that's the IBC or you're an old town and you're using some BOCA standard from 1992 that you never changed. And I don't know if that exists or not, but I hope not, quite frankly. But again, where's the authority? Each state has different laws allowing the level of authority to be given to the community. Illinois, where I live, is a home rule state, and each city designates what building code they're going to use. In most states, the state selects and adopts it and applies it to the areas it applies to across their state. So there's quite a bit of discussion about where the authority is given to select the building code. But for us, I think the issue is we're trying to give some clarity to what kind of amendments would be the most useful. I particularly highlighted the one in Telluride, Colorado, because it was probably the most extensive of any of the proposed local amendments we'd seen that affected historic buildings. And it doesn't apply to necessarily non-historic buildings, but there's a lot of judgment call on Main Street where your downtown looks like an older Main Street, but it's not designated. Could we use the historic building code for your downtown? That might be a local decision to make in lieu of adopting an historic district to say Main Street buildings can use the historic building code. That would be a way to amend the code to an alternative code.
We have a couple of questions. I think they're pretty weedy about transoms and glazing, and we'll have to come back to those. I think the more important question at the moment is, where is the confluence of the codes and the alternate approaches for historic buildings and the Secretary of the Interior standards?
Well, I think through the course of today's and the next couple of days programs, we're actually going to dig into several case studies that are going to really get into that issue. I focus most particularly on the handrails and tin ceiling issue, which I think are two of the more common ones that come up. And I actually believe handrail safety does not get examined enough, because you're going to hear statistics coming up about fires and the hazard of fires, and 3,000 people in America are killed each year in fires. Now, 30,000 people die each year from falls. So you're 10 times more likely to die, and there's huge cost to society from people falling. And yet we don't have a groundswell of changes to the building code regarding falls. It's just been underlooked. And I've often asked the question of who are the fall protection engineers as opposed to the fire protection engineers. We've got a whole skill set of people on that. And it really defaults to, it is, for me, the architecture profession and the building industry. We're actually the fall protection engineers of implementing things. So I think that's an area where we could do a lot more for safety that has been overlooked. If you saw the news last week, Donald Trump's first wife fell and died from falling on her staircase in her house. And I'm assuming it was a house with a nice new staircase. It was all legal, et cetera, and yet she fell. And so what we do know is that most of the falls that are so terrible in our culture actually happen in the bathroom. So that's really well known statistically, but it hasn't been researched and studied a lot. So it's kind of on my thinking cap of where's another safety issue that's out there, but that's for another day.
I have one more question and then we'll move on. This is, we've adopted the 2015 IBC, but have not, no, I'm sorry, the 2015 IBC, but not the IEBC. Is there a benefit to the IEBC over the IBC?
Absolutely. I mean, that was the whole point of creating an existing building code, because it quantifies a lot of these things. So we have no dispute whatsoever that the IEBC is better than using the building code, which is designed for new construction. So we get that. And I know Marilyn and I were back involved with this in the 80s when the BOCA was being changed in Chapter 34 to develop its performance rating system. So we've seen this evolving for 40 years. We were so happy to see the IEBC come out in 2003, and now it's 20 years later, and we're looking at what are the things that can be done in the IEBC for historic buildings and also for these small scale mixed use structures, which we, in my work on Main Street, see as a vacant resource that's been underutilized for decades. And we're trying to remove some of the barriers to that, which will help make more affordable housing across the country.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adam. I think we're ready to move on to the next presentation. Hello, good morning. I'm Marilyn Kaplan, co-chair of the APT Technical Committee on Codes and Standards. Thank you for joining us for this workshop. I'm going to talk about the existing building code, provide a context for it, and I hope for the upcoming sessions in this workshop. First, a few definitions of the terms I'll be using, and I'm sure we'll hear many times over the next few days. The model codes are construction codes in this context. They're developed and maintained by a standards organization independent of local or state jurisdiction. They are models until they're adopted. The International Code Council, since just before 2000, the primary organization publishing U.S. construction codes. The National Fire Protection Association, since 1896, the primary U.S. fire standards organization. The International Existing Building Code, the current version is 2021 and goes back to 2003. And historic buildings, as defined in the existing building code, are those that are listed on or eligible for historic designation by the State Historic Preservation Office or the National Register, not locally eligible. They're historic under applicable or state or local law, or they're buildings that contribute to national or state or local historic districts. Of more than 1 million historic buildings across the US, very few are where George Washington slept. This is one. This is in Newburgh, New York. And as a National Historic Landmark, it has been bestowed the highest level of historic importance. More common are the hundreds of thousands of buildings on main streets that might look like this. And there's a small map of an historic district. This is in the state of Wyoming. The National Register, again, it's the official list of U.S. historic places worthy of preservation, administered by the National Park Service in partnership with the state historic preservation offices. There are properties which may include historic districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects. The criteria for listing associated with significant events, significant persons, distinctive characteristics of type or period of method of construction, work of a master, high artistic value, or likely to yield important information about prehistory or history. For example, here's a National Historic Landmark, also from the state of Wyoming, that are the Oregon Trail Ruts. It's been 169 years since the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was formed to protect Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And it's been more than 90 years since the first historic district was created in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a tremendous boost to the field of historic preservation with the bicentennial. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed, it became model legislation followed by many states, the creation of the National Register of Historic Places, the publication of the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, and the very successful Federal Historic Tax Credit Program. In the 2021 annual report published by the National Park Service, over 45 years, the program can show tremendous accomplishments, including providing hundreds of thousands of housing units. In the code world, we have more than 100 years of legislative actions targeting the most critical issues of that time and place. Fire, 19th century, 1970s to 1990s, more environmental issues, energy, accessibility, and more recently, code requirements addressing seismic activity, sea level rise, and wildfires. The evolution of the codes to reflect the most current issues of the day is a process that absolutely will continue. For example, significant code changes were made after Hurricane Andrew in South Florida in 1992. And more recently, efforts to expand not only technical requirements, but also enforcement and administration followed the terrible fire, the Twin Peaks fire in the Bronx earlier this year. And just last year, the Dixie Fire took more than 1,000 buildings, people's homes, and of course, the forests. We, in our practices and our work and in the codes, are now much more involved in discussions related to the impact of regional climate change, as well as the most global of issues, the impact of carbon. But today we're talking about Main Street, how to better protect and use these buildings, which are critical opportunities to address housing and to strengthen communities. As mentioned, we have a 150-year-old tradition of construction rules in the US. Many of these early codes were led by the insurance industry, and this document is recognized as the earliest building code published by the American Insurance Association, later absorbed by the National Fire Protection Association. One of the most well-known fires that impacted our codes occurred 111 years ago at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City, and from which emerged the Building Exits Code, eventually the Life Safety Code published by the National Fire Protection Association. Although I really know very little about public health, much of the content of our codes is rooted in their actions, those reports and laws and activities of those looking for healthier housing and healthier cities. Most noted here in red are the tenement housing laws and the first public health code. The earliest documents were published by industry or by municipalities. Here you see examples of early standards for concrete, for fire clay construction, for fireproofing, and the municipal code of the city of Chicago. Before 1997, the US had evolved to have 3 model code organizations, each of which published their own document that addressed that region's priorities. The oldest was the Uniform Building Code of the International Conference of Building Officials. We loosely said that that was the code west of the Mississippi. In the Northeast, where I am, we had BOCA's Basic Building Code, and in the Southeast, we had the Southern Building Code Congress's Southern Standard Building Code. We also had the NFPA, who you've already heard of, founded in 1896. And an organization formed by the three model code organizations, the Council of American Building Officials, one of the first to publish energy codes for residential properties. In the late 1990s, the International Code Council, the ICC, was formed by the model code organizations, which by now have largely disappeared, as have their codes. Their ICC's first code was the International Plumbing Code, published in 1997. This is the current family of codes published by the ICC. Not all are adopted by every jurisdiction, and many jurisdictions have different editions of codes that are adopted. Of these, the typical ones that are that we deal with for existing buildings are the building code, the residential code, fire code, existing building code, mechanical and plumbing, energy conservation for sure. And we need to be aware of any local modifications, local ordinances, any local energy requirements, as well as the references to the National Electric Code, the 2010 Americans with Disabilities Act, and the guidelines, and in some cases, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. This is not simple stuff. And finally, there are, of course, other requirements, such as those addressing worker safety, lead, and asbestos, which are generally beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So how do these codes get written? The diagram on the left above shows the process for the 2024 codes. The yellow dot began the process in January 2022, and the red dot is exactly where we are now. If anyone is interested in APT's proposed code changes, please contact me or Mike Jackson, who previously spoke, and you can see speaking at the March code hearings in the photograph at the bottom right, also attended by that list of stakeholders. These are the three model codes that may be used for existing buildings. The residential code on the left is for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses that are a maximum of 3 stories above grade and have separate means of egress. The only references to existing buildings is in Appendix J, which must be separately adopted by a jurisdiction. On the far right is the building code, which can be used for existing buildings, but in general is for new construction for all non-IRC occupancies. It does not address rehabilitation. And so therefore, it's the IEBC in the center, which we're speaking of, that can be used for all occupancies and does include some historic building provisions. The IEBC was created through the merging of the rehabilitation provisions of those 3 model codes that we saw, the standard, the BOCA, and the uniform. The goals of the original publication, 2003, were to eliminate uncertainty for owners, designers, and code officials, to eliminate barriers for the rehabilitation of underutilized buildings, and to address unsafe conditions. And the intent was that required work would be proportional to owner-proposed work. Since 2003, there have been 7 additions, and the code has evolved to have 3 separate compliance paths or compliance methods. Each of these methods includes requirements for fire safety, seismic and structural, building systems, energy, and accessibility. But like if we were to each make a unique spaghetti sauce using the same basic ingredients, these methods have different priorities, approaches, and requirements. The task is to find which one is best for the unique conditions of a particular building project. In this slide, you can see that Chapter 3, Provisions for All Compliance Methods, has requirements that apply to all of the methods. And after that, one chooses Chapter 5 for prescriptive compliance, the work area method, or Chapter 13, which is performance compliance. On the right are the appendices of the IEBC, and the takeaway is that those with the orange asterisks, Appendix B, Appendix C, and Appendix D, are only part of the code if they have been specifically adopted. And this is especially important back with the residential code, as the only rehabilitation provisions there are in Appendix J. This is from the ICC website, and it shows us where the IEBC has been adopted, either in whole or as modified. It's somewhat spotty. You can see, for example, the 2021 IEBC is adopted in Wyoming, but it is only adopted by certain jurisdictions. In New York State, for example, in contrast, our version is that the IEBC is applicable statewide. Some states use the 2009 codes, and others are right current using the 2021 codes. So it's really quite a smattering of approach and currency. So where did this first edition come from? How the IEBC came to be is really quite an interesting story. The 1968 Presidential Commission, appointed by President Johnson, issued this report on civil disorders. And among the items discussed in the report was the abandonment of the cities and the destabilization of the cities. The cities were further depleted by the impacts of urban renewal, the federal highway program that helped build the suburbs, and all tied back to the 1930s redlining maps that had been prepared by the federal government. In his message to Congress in 1965, President Johnson had called for the creation of a commission to study building codes, housing codes, to use these to deal with slums, urban growth, sprawl, blight, and to ensure decent and durable housing. And at that time, we were just beginning to figure out that some of the government's previous approaches to providing housing that had been developed in the 1950s were not successful. Many of you are familiar with the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe apartments in St. Louis. Another commission, also focused on urban problems, recommended a direction that focused on HUD, housing, and building codes. The recommendations directed HUD to be engaged in housing and building codes, and that this would be among the methods to increase the supply of low-cost, decent housing. The 1969 report called for model codes for rehabilitation, federal funds for rehabilitation, directed HUD to create those model building codes with the National Institute of Building Sciences to eliminate unnecessary variations in federal construction standards, to encourage the adoption of state and local building codes, and to establish a stronger base for building code administration. While HUD was doing their work, states and model code organizations were developing their own. As you can see here, most of the work occurred before the publication of the IEBC in 2003. HUD issued some very important publications, the Rehabilitation Guidelines, this document on smart codes, which then spoke to their nationally applicable recommended rehabilitation provisions. The NFPA published 914, Rehabilitation and Adaptive Reuse of Historic Structures. And eventually, the concepts that had been developed by and with HUD and the other states and cities became the 2003 IEBC. Whereas some of the other documents have long been retired, NFPA 914 in an updated edition does survive. In principle, the IEBC measures out how unsafe a building is against the risk presented by the occupants and what the owner intended to include in their project. For example, third floor, single exit, unsprinklered wood frame building with a daycare center on the third floor, maybe a restaurant on the first floor, too great a risk. Before we had the rehab codes, how were existing buildings and rehabilitation addressed? Well, on the right, you can see an 1804 excerpt from the London Building Act, which with that double negative, buildings not to be altered so as not to conform to code, essentially asked for the buildings to go to code, current code, with some exceptions for buildings of historic interest. You may have heard reference to the 25-50% rule, the rehab value less than 25% of the building value. Those items could be repaired in kind. If the rehab value was 25 to 50% of the building value, that work needed to meet current code. And if the rehab value exceeded 50% of the building value, the whole building needed to meet current code. In general, change of occupancy, current code. The rehab codes that we just saw from the 1970s through the 1990s had a goal of addressing, again, those technical barriers to rehabilitation, to counter the requirements for existing buildings to act like new buildings, and tried to make the codes more predictable for designers and code officials. And most important, took an incremental approach to limit the areas where work was required for alterations. And you can see that stepped approach on the right side, alteration level 1, level 2, level 3. Those rehabilitation codes of that period integrated new approaches, a scoring system, meaning quantitative system for determining fire safety, dealing with hazard ratings for changes of occupancy, and a work area method for alterations and changes of occupancy. In fact, that scoring/quantitative system became what is in our codes now called the performance compliance method. The hazard ratings is in our current work area method. And in addition, we have prescriptive compliance. Here's the existing structure of the IEBC. Again, there's the residential code, which may be available to a project, the building code, which may be available to the project, and the existing building code. You can see on the left, IEBC, Chapter 3, those are the items that apply to all compliance methods, plus one needs to go to the energy code, and plus one may need to go to the fire code. So it's Chapter 3 plus a choice of one of 3 compliance methods, prescriptive compliance, or work area method, or performance method, meaning scoring. For historic buildings, the prescriptive compliance method is really most similar to the building code. It's the most traditional approach, and many are comfortable with that. The language for historic buildings requires judgment on the part of the code official. Historic buildings, relative to the existing condition, the requirement's not mandatory, except judged by the code official to constitute a distinct life safety hazard. And you heard earlier from Mike some of the complications of what that might mean. And there are additional requirements for flood hazard areas. The work area method, as I'll show you shortly, does have some historic building allowances. And the performance method, or the scoring, does not have historic building provisions, but it can be very, very successful, in particular to smaller Main Street or historic structures. The prescriptive compliance path, again, most similar to the building code, Chapter 5 of the IEBC, plus some requirements of the fire code. Change of occupancy kicks us back to the building code with some exceptions. It can work well for some relatively new buildings. Often fire suppression is required, which can be a problem for Main Street structures and other historic structures. The work area method, you've seen before an illustration of the incremental approach. It can be the most flexible. The provisions of the work area method are triggered by scale and the level of work. It attempts to limit the areas of required work, called the work area. Change of occupancies are based on the degree of hazard change, and there is an historic building overlay to the other requirements for existing buildings. Work area method, repair, alterations level 1, level 2, level 3, separate chapter for change of occupancy, and then the historic building overlay, whose requirements, again, overlay those in the alterations or the change of occupancy chapters. Repair is the lowest level of work. In general, it's the reconstruction, replacement, renewal of any part of an existing building for maintenance or to correct damage. Generally, it can be done in kind, with few exceptions. Alteration level 1 is removal, replacement, or covering existing materials or elements serving the same purpose. Alteration level 2 is when a door or window is added, space is reconfigured, a system is extended, work area is less than 50% of the building area. The requirements for alteration level 2 are those that were required for alteration level 1, plus additional requirements in the alteration level 2 chapter. And similarly, alteration level 3, where the work area exceeds 50% of the building area, picks up those requirements from alteration level 1 and from alteration level 2 chapters and brings additional requirements. Change of occupancy, the last classification of work. A change of occupancy would be still the highest set of requirements for the existing building. We call that the change of occupancy penalty, but it's a change of occupancy is a change in the occupancy classification, which is how the code organizes different occupancies by risk, or a change in the purpose or level of activity, or a change of use. And the change of use, because these terms are often used interchangeably, is when you're in the same occupancy group classification of the code, but it is a different use within that. So it might be a more intense residential use, for example. In that work area method, how a change of occupancy is dealt with is there are 3 different tables used to determine if and when you compare the pre-rehab and the proposed rehab occupancies, the relative hazard is an increase or decrease. This comes from the state of Massachusetts, some early work. The code requirements follow this movement on the scales for means of egress, heightened areas, and exposure of exterior walls. And there'll be a whole separate session on this. Chapter 12 for historic buildings is organized as I've shown here. There's general requirements, which may include for a building report be done, special occupancy for certain museums, requirements for flood areas. Then we have repairs, 1203, fire safety, which really applies to alterations and change of occupancy. And you can see that there will be some special provisions for means of egress, transoms, interior finishes, stairway enclosures, etc. A change of occupancy, again, considered to have a greater risk, brings additional requirements to that project type. And then in addition, there are special requirements in this historic building chapter for structural and for relocated buildings. There's a lot of text describing what a building code report is, but essentially what it says is you're going to investigate and evaluate the building. The design professional will file a report if the code official determines that's necessary. The report will identify each required feature in compliance, each feature that is not in compliance, and there are some special provisions for seismic design categories D, E, or F. And we'll speak again to how to use the building report as a design tool and as a documentation tool. That last compliance method, performance path, is performance compliance. It's called compliance alternatives in some codes. It's had different names, but again, it is the scoring system that this workshop will focus on. Essentially, we are going to compare the numerical scores of proposed works in 21 primarily fire safety parameters to establish the score of a proposed project. And if it exceeds a given number, you have a safe building. If it does not exceed it, then you've got different options to go back and increase the number, the score that you receive for these parameters. These are mostly safety related, and the performance method seems to work very, very well with smaller mixed use buildings, in particular fire suppression and occupancy separations and means of egress. The IEBC includes something produced in those early HUD documents, the rehab guidelines. Resource A is the guidelines on fire ratings of archaic materials and assemblies. Very, very useful because these are not systems, building systems or assemblies otherwise with ready access to what the fire resistance ratings of those are. So a very important resource included in the appendix materials. So if this is so great, what are some of the barriers that we have? Well, when we talk about all of the compliance methods, the IEBC is a difficult code to use. It can be improved. It's essentially, at its heart, 25 years old and lacks comprehensive updates. It has not incorporated some of the common solutions and emerging technologies. It has minimized the role of judgment, favoring quantitative versus qualitative thinking on the part of the code official and the design professional is what is a reasonable or equivalent solution. We still have that change of occupancy penalty. Construction classification limits can be narrow. Big issue, where is water? What happens if we don't have water, but fire suppression is required? And there are some very specific and narrow issues related to the lack of a definition of distinct fire hazard or work area definition, things like that. For Main Street buildings, in addition, we have some other barriers. Main Street buildings, the code does not understand these to be very important existing resources. They are hiding in plain sight of the code. Existing limitations of Main Street buildings are not addressed or really understood or worked with, meaning what construction type are they? What's the footprint? We've got zero property lines. We've got existing dimensions that can be modified. Main Street occupancy separation between typically the first floor and upper floors can be very problematic. We may not have room to get a second means of egress. The fire suppression requirements can be substantial. In thousands and thousands of existing Main Street buildings around the country, architects are not working on the project. And so the ability to work through some of the alternatives that are permitted can be very difficult. And for historic Main Street buildings in particular, we can find the code to be inconsistent and unpredictable. In closing, beyond using the codes to support the reuse of Main Street buildings, I want to mention the significant interactions with the property maintenance code, or whatever it might be called in your community, and code enforcement. While it's not the subject of our work over these 3 days, this does merit future discussions, because a poorly maintained building becomes eventually unrehabilitatable, and then we've got nothing. These vacant and underutilized buildings are key to addressing housing issues and to strengthen communities across the country. And this is a recent graph from the New York Times talking about critical housing supply shortages, not just localized, although there's a lot of red in California and on the East Coast, but so many communities are not using their upper floors to the capacity that they can be used. And these are arguably the greatest opportunity we have, literally hiding there in plain sight. Thank you. Enjoy the workshop.
Marilyn, I continue to be impressed by the broad knowledge you have of how the codes came to be, what we've got in there, how it developed from the model codes, etc. Any thoughts from you on what you're hearing from others about the historic building chapter, since that's kind of one of our specialty areas with APT? What's the general consensus of issues you hear about the historic buildings?
Oh, I'd say in general, beyond historic buildings that the IEBC is complicated. It needs an update. It's largely unchanged since 20 years ago. And there's been quite a bit of support for the concept of re-envisioning how small buildings are treated. And back to your question, better alignment with historic preservation policy, both in language or the types of issues that the code can readily address without a lot of compliance alternatives or alternative approaches being sought. And certainly many in our audience have experience with historic buildings and alternate solutions. And
recording in progress.
Happy to hear from you. The IEBC 20, 30 years ago, it was a huge leap forward. And it appears that although I've just spoken to how this was focused on housing, that the code, when it came to be, really spoke to building reuse in general and was a foundation for some of the early tax credit programs and the other historic preservation programs growing by state and nationally. But today's topic, today and Wednesday and Thursday, is really about smaller buildings on Main Street. And these have been left aside. And I don't think we've eliminated the barriers. And in fact, as the codes have become more stringent over time, which is what they do, we've created more barriers. So I think there's much, much more that we can do. And we're hearing that when we make these presentations or go to code hearings, that there's so much more to do to address some of the current issues, primarily around housing and around climate.
Are there still some of the residue of the old rules on 50% or those direct cost things still left in the code, or have we pretty much eliminated those kind of prescriptive provisions?
You must be asking me that because you know the answer. I can't tell you how often and I assume you and so many others, refer back to the 25-50% rule, which otherwise does not exist.
So really, it was a question from the chat room that people, so I have that sense that the legacy of that rule is just still out there in the code world.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we do have the 50% area calculation. Quick question for Main Street. I don't know, does the basement count as the area when you're doing the 50% calculation? Does the basement count as?
I would assume it. Generally, I assume not, unless there are any habitable spaces in that area.
Yeah.
But we might.
So again, this would be a typical two-story Main Street building with a basement. If you're renovating the second floor, but the basement doesn't count, then you reach the 50% area, which is, so that's why that's a particularly relevant question. So it's all about the occupancy classification of the basement.
That's right. We may hear from code officials to the contrary, but that's what I assumed as well.
Yeah, because that comes up a fair amount, that calculation basis. Because we've seen the rehab code try to be more flexible and not be stuck with those old cost-based rules. And largely cost rules have now disappeared from the code, other than accessibility and the 20%, which we'll hear more about.
It's a complicated code. It's very common that people don't know there are 3 separate compliance paths in there. And in fact, there's really 5 or 6 compliance paths, because you can always use the building code or the residential code. And then there is the other compliance path of using the code when that was available when the building was constructed. But within the IEBC proper, its primary focus is on those 3 different compliance paths. And you can't pick and choose. You can't use those compliance alternatives from Chapter 12, that's part of it for historic buildings, that's part of the work area method, and take them over to the prescriptive or the performance. So there's a misunderstanding there. There is, as you said, still an assumption about that 25-50% rule, or if you do a lot of work, you have to bring the whole building up to code. And the change of occupancy remains a real challenge to get clarity on that.
Yeah, another question came up of the flexibility for the 3,000 square foot under buildings where they're kind of grandfathering in everything. And it said, what stipulations or allowances become available for buildings about or 3,000? So if you're 3,100 square feet, is it still, where's the flexibility? Yeah.
Well, those, of course, are some of the issues that we're trying to take into the ICC code hearings. And so whether we get to pick up a little bit of square footage through tolerances and some of those calculations, or clarify that it's the small building is less than 3,000 square foot, not total, but per floor, and to mirror, say, how accessibility codes deal with existing buildings and 3,000 square feet. So we're trying to make a parallel there. And again, embrace a wider set of tools and eliminate some of the barriers for the smaller buildings, less than 3,000 square foot per floor.
Yeah. Yeah, this came up before with the house museums, and we actually tried to change it from 3,000 square foot total to 3,000 square feet per floor to be more, again, more adaptable. We're going to cut short today's lunch hour and launch fairly soon into the next presentations from Frank Heitzman. There'll be his case study on a small Main Street building conversion. And then he's also going to speak to us on universal design, and we're going to run his two presentations back to back without a gap as a way to condense some time today. So the next thing that's going to come up for everybody is going to be the case study on a small Main Street building with the speaker, Frank Heitzman. So we're making a few little audible calls in the program or in the play today to kind of tighten the framework and squeeze things together to make up for our little technical glitch this morning.